We are live. Mr. Contempasses?
It looks like we may have lost him.
Oh, yes,
Actually, okay, there he is.
there he is. Mr. Contempasses, you're on mute.
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the meeting of the Exam Schools Admissions Task Force. Because this is a remote session, I will ask Ms. Parvex to call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Contempasses. Mr. Acevedo?
Here.
Ms. Aguirre? Ms. Aguirre is here, but she cannot unmute herself at this moment. Mr. Chernow? Mr. Kreger?
Here.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom? Ms. Grassa?
Here.
Ms. Lam?
Here.
Ms. Nagasawa?
Here.
Ms. Garrett? Dr. Tang?
Here.
Ms. Waite? Ms. Sullivan?
Present.
And Mr. Contempasses.
Present. Thank you, Ms. Parvex. We are pleased to be offering live simultaneous interpretation in Spanish, Haitian Creole, Cape Verdean, Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Arabic, and American Sign Language. After I finish introducing the interpreters, we will activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. Click the icon to select your language preference. Our Spanish interpreter this evening is Juan Bernal. Please invite our Spanish-speaking audience to switch their Zoom channel in Spanish.
Certainly, Mr. Contempasses. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, distinguished guests. My name is Juan Bernal. I am the simultaneous Spanish interpreter assigned to this meeting tonight. For those in need of interpretation, I will now proceed to explain how to access the interpretation feature in Spanish. Muy buenas noches para todos. Mi nombre es Juan Bernal. Soy el intérprete para español asignado para la reunión de hoy para aquellas personas que necesiten de un intérprete. ¿Cómo van a accesar la interpretación? Simplemente busquen en la parte baja de la pantalla un globo redondo que dice interpretación. Tienen inglés y español. Seleccionen español para escuchar mi interpretación simultánea en español. Igualmente, aquellas personas que se estén conectando de un teléfono celular, en la parte superior derecha del celular, van a ver 3 puntos. Uno de los puntos dice Interpretation o interpretación en español. Seleccionan interpretación y posteriormente seleccionan español para escuchar mi interpretación en español. Thank you very much. Please proceed, Mr. Contempasses. Next interpreter. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Cape Verdean interpreter is Josanne Lopes. Would you please give the Zoom instructions in Cape Verdean?
Thank you, Mr. Contempasses. Good evening, everyone. Boa tarde, meu nome é Josiane, é minha intérprete de crioulo. Para que a reunião ali, para obter acesso à interpretação simultânea, clica no ícone de globo na parte inferior do ecrã e seleciona Cabo Verdeano. Se você usa telemóvel, clica naqueles 3 pontinhos na parte superior do ecrã e depois seleciona também. Para alguma pergunta, coloca na chat. Obrigada. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Vietnamese interpreter is Yuan Tru. Please give Zoom instructions in Vietnamese.
Good afternoon. My name is Duyên. I'm Vietnamese interpreter for the meeting tonight. Xin chào các anh chị. Em sẽ là thông dịch viên liên tục cho các anh chị. Nếu mà cần tiếng Việt thì xin hãy bấm vào quả cầu và chọn ngôn ngữ tiếng Việt. Duyên sẽ cung cấp thông dịch cho anh chị nhé. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Cantonese interpreter is Anna Tse. Please give the Zoom instructions in Cantonese.
And thank you, Mr. Contempasses. Good evening, everyone. 大家好，我係今晚嘅同步翻譯，我係 Anna。咁大家見到個地球儀嘅時候咧，就撳落去，就揀 Chinese 就會成功進入咗廣東話嘅翻譯頻道噶啦。如果你用手機嘅話咧，記得撳嗰3個點，咁咧亦都會成功進入咗揀 Chinese，亦都會成功進入咗廣東話嘅翻譯頻道噶啦。多謝大家，一陣間見。 Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our Mandarin interpreter, I'm sorry, is Terry Yin. Please give the Zoom instructions in Mandarin.
Thank you, Mr. Captain Passes. Hi, this is Terry. I'll be your Mandarin interpreter. 大家好，我是 Terry， 我会是你的国语翻译。待会呢，你在屏幕下方呢就可以看到一个地球仪的图标，你点一下地球仪的图标，选择 Mandarin， 你就可以进入到国语的翻译了。如果你是用手机或者是平板电脑上来的话呢，你可以选择屏幕下方的3个点，然后再选择语言的选项，也可以进入到这个 Mandarin， 就是国语的翻译。好，谢谢大家，一会见 ，Thank you.
Thank you. Our Haitian Creole interpreter is Sergio Saint Hilaire. Please give the Zoom instructions in Haitian Creole.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. This is Sergio Saint-Hilaire, Haitian Creole interpreter. Nous contents encore aujourd'hui pour nous entrer dans la conversation avec vous, pour nous faire connaître tout ça qui a passé dans l'après-midi. Et nous là pour nous traduire pour, si vous avez besoin d'entrer dans la conversation, ou à cliquer sur le globe là qui est en bas écran là, ou à entrer là-dedans. C'est un plaisir pour nous encore une fois pour nous participer et nous remercions nous de bonne écoute. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Our Arabic interpreter is Ahmed Al-Rubaye. Please give the Zoom instructions in Arabic.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ahmed Al-Rubaye. I will be your Arabic interpreter today. مرحبا، أنا اسمي أحمد الربيعي. أنا مترجم اللغة العربية لهذا اليوم. بإمكانكم الاستماع إلى الترجمة باللغة العربية من خلال الذهاب إلى أسفل الشاشة. ستشاهدون علامة الكرة الأرضية. اضغط على هذه العلامة وستظهر لك الاختيارات بالنسبة إلى اللغات. قم باختيار اللغة العربية وعندها ستتمكن من الاستماع إلى الترجمة كاملة. شكرا جزيلا. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have American Sign Language interpreters, Andrew Pidkameni and Katie McFarlane. Please introduce yourselves. We will now activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to remind everyone to speak at a slower pace to assist our interpreters. The second item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from the May 21st, 2021 meeting. You all have received the minutes. At this time, I would like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes as presented. May I have a motion, please?
I so move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion or objection to the motion? Ms. Parvex, will you please call the roll?
Thank you. Mr. Acevedo?
Given my absence at meeting, I abstain.
Thank you. Ms. Aguirre?
Yes.
Mr. Chernow? Mr. Kreger?
Yes.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom? Ms. Grassa?
Yes.
Ms. Lam?
Yes.
Ms. Nagasawa?
Yes.
Ms. Garrett? Dr. Tung?
Yes.
Ms. Sullivan?
Yes.
And Mr. Contopasis?
Yes, the minutes are approved. Ms. Hogan, the item number 4 is a review of data and simulations requested. May I ask you to share with us the amount of work that you've been able to accomplish?
Hi, thank you. Nice to see everyone. So we have a few updates to share. So if you remember on Tuesday, just 3 short days ago, there were some questions around census tract tiers and what it might look like to make some adjustments to the tiers. So what we've done this week is look at 6 possible tier options. You'll remember that we started with 4 tiers. that is similar to what Chicago does. There was a suggestion on Tuesday of what might this look like if there were 5 tiers, what might it look like if there were 8 tiers. So we've simulated both of those. There was also a question about the tiers were proportionally sized based on the number of school-age children living in each tier. And there was a question of what it might look like if we used school-age children in grades 5 through 8. I incorrectly said that was not available. So I'd like to thank Ms. Nagasawa for suggesting it. And we were able to access that from the American Community Survey. So we're going to look at tonight 6 different tier options, as well as the student population within those tiers. And the student population we're looking at tonight is the 7th grade school year 2021 exam schools applicant pool. So those are students who applied for entry for fall of 2020. Okay. And as always, please, there's something clarifying questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to start with a few screenshots of maps. So on the left, this map should look very familiar. It's the map that we have been looking at. A reminder that the lower the tier number, the higher the need. So the dark orange is the highest need area to the dark blue. The red dots represent public housing because part of the request was to see how the tiers might change around public housing locations if we make some of these adjustments. And then on the right, it's a very similar map, but this is proportionally done by grades 5 through 8 enrollment. So while the majority of census tract tiers don't change, I can highlight 2 light orange tiers here up in East Boston become 2 light blue tiers, excuse me. So they move from tier 2 to tier 3. There's another example here in Austin. And there might be another tier or 2 that changes.
The bottom, at the very bottom, the red dot is in something that goes from
light blue to dark blue, yes. So I think that's an example. The red dot again is a public housing location. Ms. Lum, did you have a clarifying question?
Yes, I just wanted to know how on this map, what the criteria was to be tier 1, what the criteria is to be tier 2, etc.
So it's the same methodology that we've been using. So every census tract tier gets an overall score based on the 5 metrics, which I don't have in the slide deck, but I can pull up. And then the tier cutoff is done in order to make the tiers proportionally sized based on the number of either all school-age children, which is on the left, or school-age children only in grades 5 through 8. Well, there's a table that I think might help explain that a little bit more that we'll get to in a minute. Dr. Chung?
So just to summarize this slide, it seems that whenever there was a change between the left one and the right one, the change went towards the higher number.
I think that would be true, but we can confirm that looking actually at the spreadsheet of tiers to confirm the way they're changing. Ms. Sullivan?
Yes, thank you. So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this. So a couple of things. So the cutoff is not based on a socioeconomic level. It's, if I'm understanding you correctly, each of the census tracts is evaluated based on the 5 metrics.
Yes.
And you essentially put them on a list. And then you count off. How does the count off go?
Yep. So they are in the list, they are ranked from lowest score to highest score.
Yeah.
And then we add together the number of school-age children as reported by the American Community Survey to get to a like a cumulative number of children. So say there were 20,000 children and we had 4 tiers. We would want to be roughly at 5,000 children in each tier. We know it won't be perfect because we can't cut a tier in half, for example.
Right.
So you might end up with one tier that's, 5,050, one that's 4,950. But that's the idea behind the methodology.
And so then you're looking at census tracts and you are then in each census tract has, if we're looking at the map on the right, so each census tract has an X number of school-age children in grades 5 to 8. And you are grouping census tracts until you get to, in your example, roughly 5,000 children.
Correct.
And that would be like tier 1. And then you do the next roughly 5,000 and that's tier 2.
Yes.
Got it. And could you pull up the metrics when you get a chance, just so that we can refresh our recollection on what those metrics were? I do recall that there was one that Chicago has that I know at least I had a question about its relevancy for us. So just wanna, thank you.
So it's median household income, percent of households occupied by the owner, percent of families headed by a single parent, percent of households where a language other than English is spoken, and then an educational attainment metric where they do a weighted average of 5 different data points.
Within the census tract?
Yeah, so they take, for the percentage of adults without a high school diploma, that's multiplied by 0.2. Adults with a high school diploma is multiplied by 0.4. Some college by 0.6, college degree by 0.8, and advanced degree by 1 to get the aggregate educational attainment. And then the data point that Chicago uses that is not in here, it's down noted in this italicized note of, it's a school performance metric, which is a weighted average of performance on state assessment tests based on the number of students attending schools in that census tract.
So with ACS, I know they also have, we also would have available to us poverty indices. Is that something, well, I guess, let me ask you myself. Not for, obviously not for this discussion, but as I think about it, I do wonder if we were to, continue to explore the tiers, thinking about the metrics, again, trying to get to socioeconomic, really get to, the socioeconomic piece. I wonder if there's a factor a metric we could include relative to poverty rates within the census tract for children, childhood poverty rates, because we know that is, those numbers are increasing. And so that's something that I think I'd like to see. Just as a side note, Ms. Hogan.
Yep, we can explore what the relevant data points are that are available by census tract.
Great, thank you, appreciate it.
Ms. Lum?
Along those lines, I believe one of the data points through the ACS is something called the indices of concentration at the extremes, ICE. And that goes to speaking at a neighborhood level, the actual distribution of wealth. So you can have neighborhoods like the South End, like South Boston, where there are high concentrations of wealth that skew the median, and still have people who are floating in and out of the poverty level. And so within the census tract, I think there's even more nuance with regards to that particular assessment.
What is that called again, Ms. Lum?
It's the index of concentration at the extremes.
Thank you.
And this was part of the, I learned about this through the Harvard Geocode program that was brought up at the public testimonial the other night.
Excellent, thank you.
Dr. Chung?
So I'm guessing that there's some way to add up 1 through 5 to rank the census tracts. But there are a couple that are obvious, which ends up being in tier 1 versus 4, like number 1 and number 5. But like number 4, % of households where a language other than English is spoken. How does that, is that like a higher percentage puts you in a lower tier or a higher tier? I don't know what the value, if it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, the way it's coded right now is that the lower the percentage, the higher the percentile, if that makes sense.
The higher the tier that it would be placed in?
The other way around.
Most likely, because a high tier number, right, the lowest tier indicates
higher need.
Right. So this is the way it's coded right now.
Do you see why some people think?
And this is the metric that San Antonio chose not to include in their tier version. So that might be a consideration here.
So Ms. Hogan, I don't know necessarily that I would, that I have a concern about it being included. I think but now that Dr. Tung has raised the question, I just want to make sure that we understand how it has been included into the simulation. So if we have a census tract that has a high percentage of households where English is not the first language spoken, is the likelihood, like if there were no other factors, that census tract would would be at a lower number. So it would probably be a 1 or a 2.
Correct.
That's correct?
Mhm.
Okay.
Wait, sorry. I thought tier 4 was the one with kids in most need, or do I have it backwards?
Yeah, that's backwards.
Okay, okay.
So highest need is the lowest number.
Mhm. And that's helpful to remember because we're about to look at a version with 5 tiers and a version with 8 tiers.
Yep.
So tier 1 is always the highest level of need.
Thank you.
Okay. So this is the map with 5 tiers. You will get these slides as well as an interactive map as you did previously. So I don't expect you to necessarily have immediate comments now. We are also going to look at additional data around these, but wanted to show the visual map for you to be able to see.
Ms. Hogan, could you share with us what you have found in terms of increasing the number of tiers, in terms of the distribution by tier?
I've got like 5 slides on that, Mr. Contempasis. It's coming.
Okay, I'll wait. Thank you.
I maybe should have started with those instead of the maps. But we can come back to the maps if we need to. So this is 8 tiers. And I think, Mr. Kreger, I think this was originally your idea in thinking that it might help differentiate around some of our areas with public housing. So if I go back down to this red dot at the bottom of the city here, where it's no longer in the darkest, highest tier, but it was, I believe, in the 4-tier version, as an example.
So, oops. Okay, no, I've picked up my own answer here. Thank you.
I'm going to go into some of the data, but we can always go back to the maps. So this slide is looking at when it's distributed for all school age children, proportional to all school age children. And it shows you for each version, the number of tracks, the number of children according to the ACS. So you see that it's in the 19,000 to 20,000 range for each tier. And then for another layer of perspective related to exam schools, have included the number of students from the 2021 application cycle and how many students lived in each tier. So you can see that the greatest number of applicants from that particular year are coming from tier 4, which also has the highest number of census tracts.
Does this include, this is not the interim year, is it?
No, it's the year. So these are
The year
students,
before.
students applying for fall 2020 admission.
Okay,
So these students took the IC in the fall of 2019.
Yep.
And this is 7th grade only. Ms. Lem?
Would we want to include the interim data as well to see how it compares both to historic as well as to the proposed tract? Just to see how big of a difference there is between tracts and zip codes?
I like that idea, Ms. Lum. Yep. Ms. Hogan, I'm also wondering, because as I look at the maps, you know, one of the concerns that we're trying to solve for, you know, is public housing that may be surrounded by higher income housing. And so I'm starting to wonder if, you know, similar to how we have, I'm sorry, similar to the zip code we created for students with students in DCF custody and students impacted by housing fragility. I'm wondering if perhaps, you know, if we were to move in this direction, we should have a tier that is for public housing. And the reason I say that is because the maps would suggest that the tiers would not likely address the, you know, the underlying issue we're trying to solve for with respect to public housing in neighborhoods that are otherwise higher income.
Ms. Garrett?
Thanks. Just wanted to piggyback on Ms. Sullivan's concern there. And I'm wondering if the numbers aren't as even as some of the other tracks, if there might be some ways to think about it around either a set aside number of seats potentially, if they don't break down as evenly as the other tiers, do some sort of proportional seat allocation, or if there's some opportunity because this is a universe of students, at least in BPS, that would be known, to reassign their tier based on that information.
Ms. Garrett, can you walk through that again? So are you saying?
I was just what I was thinking, because I'm worried about us at the same issue, Ms. Sullivan. I was just thinking, I don't know what that number is, but let's say that that number is significantly smaller.
Got it.
Than the 4 tiers, so you can't use the same proportionality as the rest of the assignment. That there could be some workarounds in some way, either to do it as a set aside % of seats at the school, or to potentially reassign a student to a different tier based on information. But we would have to know how large that universe is. You know, do you know what I mean?
Yep, I do. Yep, nope, that's clear.
And there's some demographic data coming that might help inform that conversation. Just want to pause for a moment on a very similar slide, but this is just the difference when we look at grades 5 through 8 instead of all school-age children.
And I'm sorry, Ms. Hogan, the ACS data is available the most recent ACS data is available as of when?
This data is using the 5-year average from 2019 back to 2015. The 2016 to 2020 5-year average data, I believe, is scheduled to be released in December of 2021.
Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Krieger?
Thank you. Ms. Hogan, I really appreciate you walking us through all of this and doing all of this work between today and Tuesday. I'm curious about the variation in the number of students per tier, particularly in the 5 and 8 tier models compared to the 4-tier model here on this slide. So, for example, when I look at the 4-tier model, I see that there's, a variation of about 200 students between tier 2 and tier 3 in the 4-tier model. But I see that there's a variation of about 5,000 students between 500 students between tier 1 and tier 2 of the 5-tier model, right? And a variation of about 700 students between tier 1 and tier 2 in the 8-tier model, right? And I just, I completely get that there's no way to cut this perfectly and, and make all the numbers the same. But I wondered if you could explain why it's a greater variation the further we expand the number of tiers.
Yep. If you'll indulge a spreadsheet for a moment. So this is census tract data that is used to create the tiers. And the 2 columns I've highlighted in yellow are the numbers of children grades 5 to 8, and then the number of children, school-age children in the tier. And you can just see that they differ widely. And so depending on where that tier cutoff happens, that impacts those total number of children in each tier, right? So here I go 450 and then 1,095 is the next ranked tier. So I hope that sort of helps. It's the nature of how many students, how many children are listed and sort of how the math works out. Does that help?
I believe it does, but so if you could go back to the slide that we were viewing before.
Yep.
And if we were looking, say, at the tiers 1 and 2 of the 8-tier model, right? I guess what I'm asking is just eyeballing the other tiers in that model, right? Why is it that 300 students in tier, let me see if I can say this right. Why is it that 300 students in tier 2 ended up, why couldn't we move 300 students from tier 2 to tier 1 to better balance out the number of school-age children? Is it because they are significantly different? They've reached a different cutoff when it comes to the our combined socioeconomic factors? Like, how is it that they split off differently from their peers in tier 1?
Yep, so. I'm trying to look at where the tier cutoff is real quick.
Are you talking about the 700 student difference between tier 1 and tier 2 in the 8 tract column?
Yes. And that's for number of school-age children, not, right? Yeah.
And I have a question that might be related to that, but I'm just curious if the 14 tracks in the 8-tier model, if those same 14 tracks would be in the tier 1 models before it. Because those are then, as you got more finite, that would be the core neediest group, if I'm not mistaken, right?
So I think what you're asking is these 14 and 15 tracks here are the same 29 tracks from over here. So tier 1 and 2 in the 8-tier model is the aggregate of tier 1 in the 4-tier model. Did that answer your question?
Well, go ahead.
I think so. I guess what I'm saying is the more tiers we get at, that tier 1 becomes, I'm guessing, more refined in terms of need.
Need as measured by these scores from census.
As these metrics.
And so is the question, Mr. Kreger, that you're asking, I think it might be mine as well, why they could not be made as evenly as possible as the cutoff by it, the tiers are more relative to one another, right? So couldn't the tiers be based on the school age in grades 5 through 8 or applicants or whoever, but just made even, especially if we're having an equal percentage of students from each one? Like, I think that means that the tiers would have to be redefined annually. Is that was that Mr. Kreger, was that your question?
Yes, that's a clear way to put it. Thank you, Ms. Garrett.
So I think there's potential for the number of school-age children to change with each census, and the potential for with each American Community Survey, and the potential for all of these metrics to change. What we've found is using the 5-year average usually kind of smooths out any large changes. So you shouldn't see like a census tract going from tier 1 to tier 8 and back to tier 1.
So maybe framing it this way. So with the five-tier model in the middle, it seems as if students in tier 5, because of their significantly higher number, it could be viewed as potentially problematic to admit the same percentage of students from each one, being that there are more students significantly in one. Could 7 of the 62 tiers be moved down, or some proportional adjustment to the tiers, but even if it's based on the 5-year average, but or are they not relative to one? Can they not be ranked within that? Like, what's preventing us from making the numbers even or more even?
We can certainly adjust slightly based on the school age children. I'm wondering though if you and Mr. Kreger are actually thinking about the applicants and adjusting the tier sizes based off of applicants, which would be a different way of adjusting the tiers than we've done so far.
So I was speaking solely to school-age children, and part of what I think I'm liking in seeing an increasing number of tiers is that it also does a better job of evening out the number of applicants, at least for the 2021 school year, right? The question that I had was, if we focus in solely on the 8-tier model and look at the number of school-age children for tiers 1 and 2, tier 1 is significantly lower than an eyeballed average of about 2,800 students, right? Whereas tier 2 is significantly higher than an eyeballed average of about 2,800 students. Forgive the noise in the background. I'm curious, you know, what would happen if approximately 300 of the students in tier 2 were moved down to tier 1? Would that disrupt the socioeconomic metrics in a significant way? Because it would look like it would also roughly even out the number of applicants from each of those tiers as well. And it's never going to be perfect, but I'm just curious about how that works.
Yeah, so without getting too deep into the math, essentially took the total number of students as reported by the ACS. So in this case, that's 22,736. And I said, there's 8 tiers. So what is 1/8 of that number? 2,842. So then I take the cumulative number of school-age children in tracks until I hit that number. And then I assign all of those tiers to tier 1. And then I move on to assign until I hit that next cutoff. So in this case, the tier that missed the cutoff would have put us at 2,881. And that's only about 40 kids different from that 1/8 number. So I think it would make sense to make that adjustment to the tier, which would have a ripple effect, right, down the rest of the tiers. And so I think that's a thing we can look more closely at as we delve deeper into this. So did that make sense?
That makes sense to me. Thank you very much.
Mr. Krager, may I ask you a question? Are you suggesting that 1 and 2 be combined and that combination continue all the way down? So 3, what is 3 and 4 in that 8 tier is combined?
No, Mr. Contempasis, what I was suggesting is that if we look at the second to last column solely for tiers 1 and 2 in the 8-tier model, right? The 2,493 and then the 3,156, right? Per Ms. Hogan's comment, the 1/8 of the students and school-age children are about 2,800 students, right? And so if the next chunk of students from the census tract were moved up into tier 1 from tier 2, right? Then that would likely balance out this smaller number of students in tier 1,
yeah,
as well as the larger number of students in tier 2. And as Ms. Hogan said, it would have a ripple effect on the other tiers here, right? And my question in doing that is also, what impact would that have on the number of applicants? Because it looks to me, the 267 at the top is the lowest number of applicants. The 381 right below it is the largest number that we see until we get to the very bottom, right? Would it make those numbers more proportional to the whole and have a similar ripple effect on the remaining tiers?
So, Mr. Kreger, it just so happens that the model using all grades, all school-age children,
yeah,
does actually, I know these numbers are different because they're a different, it's a different metric.
Yep.
But when I look at the tier changes in the file, it does exactly that. It bumps one additional tier into tier 1. So you see that number of tracks is 15.
Right.
So I do say, so to Ms. Garrett, Dr. Tung's hand has been raised for a bit. I don't know if she was waiting to get in on this conversation or if there was another piece she wanted to raise, but just want to make sure.
Yep.
Thank you. Is it my turn?
Yep.
Okay. From these slides, so I guess always when we make decisions that are closer to the child, it's better. So 8 tiers are always going to be better than 4. But if you look at the previous map, the dots, the red dots, which signify subsidized housing, meaning low income kids, they're still in higher tiers. There were a lot in the light blue, right? And there are plenty of kids who lack resources, who don't live in subsidized housing, but could still be scattered throughout. So I'm just like trying to make a conclusion about the data that you've shared. And my conclusion is more tiers is better, but it doesn't solve our problem, which is why I appreciated the creative thinking about the tier for kids in subsidized housing, or some way to accommodate that.
Ms. Lum?
I wonder if replacing median income with a different ACS metric would get at the need in a different way. Meaning that if you used, I'm just curious to know what would happen if you just used housing as an example, or wealth as opposed to income as an example. Wealth would be indicated by home ownership and other assets versus income, which is a salary based metric. And if you used home ownership as the primary economic factor, then whether that may end up grouping that the public housing, subsidized housing students into its own tier anyways, regardless of the census tract. I don't know if that makes sense. Like regardless of where they are located geographically. I don't know if that is faulty thinking or not.
I think I follow your train of thought. We'd have to look at the data to see if it bears out. I'm going to keep going. There's more. I did want to just display a potential thinking to contextualize within admissions, because we just looked at the number of applicants within each tier from the 2021 admission cycle. So this table assumes 1,000 invitations. It assumes 20% are citywide based on previous conversations. And then if you equally distributed the remaining seats across tiers, what that would mean. So in an 8-tier model, it would be roughly 100 seats for each tier if you distribute the first 200 citywide. So just want to provide that as a little context of how this could be used. These percentages, of course, can be adjusted. So now we're going to get into a little of the demographic data from that 2021 applicant pool. I know this is a little small. So you'll see 6 tables. You're going to see a bunch of slides that look very similar. So spend a little time explaining this slide. 6 tables, 2 tables for each of the 4 tiers, 5 tiers, and 8 tiers. The top table will show distribution for grades 5 to 8. The second table shows the all grades distribution. And then the pinkish colors are the 4 tiers, the bluish are 5, and the orangish are the 8. And so this slide shows by economic status, so that economically disadvantaged indicator. We see across all of the numbers of tiers, higher percentages for tier 1 to lower percentages in whatever the highest tier number is. And I think to some of the comments that have been made, there are economically disadvantaged students in every tier, and there are students who are not economically disadvantaged in every tier.
Thank you.
So our next slide looks at race. This one I split onto 2 slides because there are more race categories. But so you'll see the 4-tier and 5-tier versions. And each table also has the total to reference across this applicant pool. This is the same data, but for the 8-tier model. Dr. Tang?
I just want to make sure I understand. So these numbers in the right columns, are they the same as what happened this year invitee wise, or I'm lost.
So this is the applicant pool from the fall for enrollment for the fall of 2020. So like the applicant pool for this year's 7th graders. And so the total is just of the students in the applicant pool. What was the breakdown? Invitations are not displayed here at all. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Then go into male, female for each of the tier versions. Oops, sorry. The slide is English learner status.
I'm sorry. Monica, could you go back to the last slide just for a second? Thank you. Thanks.
No problem. English learner status. And then I think this is my last slide, but IEP status. If students have an IEP or not. Thank you. So that's it for my presentation, but you'll also get a link to a map that looks very similar, but it has each of the 6 options that you can click through, zoom in and out, how you would like. So this will come with the slides.
Ms. Hogan, I had raised a question on Tuesday about neighborhood diversity. And so do you have additional information on that, or should we just be using the maps that you presented in connection with the tiers to kind of analyze the neighborhood diversity impact or not?
We thought about how to try and display some of the tier data with zip codes. But because there are multiple tiers within a zip code, could not really figure out how to present that. But if this is a great group of minds, so if people have ideas on how what might be helpful to understand that, happy to take that into consideration. Ms. Lum?
Rather than, is there any way to overlay just the neighborhood map, not zip code map, but the neighborhood map over this data so that you can see where, so a census tract might cover, for example, South End, Chinatown, and maybe a little bit of downtown, downtown Crossing, but you'd at least see where the South End neighborhood is and where the South Boston neighborhood is and all of that.
I think we can do that. I will check with the person on my team who made the maps.
All about GIS.
Ms. Sullivan, would that help with your question?
It would help to be able to understand kind of where, again, kind of the how this, it will help me to better understand if the tier, if simply using tiers is enough to not only tackle the socioeconomic piece, but also the neighborhood piece, or if there's something else we would need to think about relative to neighborhoods to ensure that there's neighborhood diversity, or to help ensure there's neighborhood diversity.
Mr. Kreger?
Wonder if to that end, there'd be a way to show what the invitation rates from the 2020-2021 school year would look like under each of these models, broken out by neighborhood, right? So that we could see the impact on neighborhood diversity for each of the models proposed, knowing that it's only 1 year's worth of data.
Mr. Kreger, can I clarify what, are you referring to the interim year or
Yes.
the prior year?
I'm sorry, I was referring to the prior year because that is the data that's before us, right? But then I would want to, well, I don't know how much time you have between this Friday and the Tuesday after Memorial Day to do any of this, Monica. But just drawing from the data that's in front of us, right? I'm curious about seeing it through the lens of the invitation rates, because then we could see it impact on at least neighborhood diversity, if not some of the other factors that we've looked at.
And you would be thinking about if we were to take applicants from each of those years and use this model for distributing invitations?
Yes, if there were a straightforward way to do that, so that if, for example, in the 4-tier model, the top 20% of students that year who were let in based on the combination of their grades and IC scores got the first 20% of seats, and then each tier was divided accordingly. And so we would have to be taking, you know, those results and fitting them into this new system if there were a straightforward way to do that, right? And it seems like a two-step thing for me, right? One is, you know, putting those scores into this system, and then from the system, figuring out the resulting impact on the neighborhood diversity Ms. Sullivan referenced, right? So not just, you know, how many tier 1 students got in, for example, but what does that look like when we look at the individual neighborhoods, perhaps best described by zip codes here. And I'm not saying that this has to be done by Tuesday. I'm just asking if this is a way to help us reach an understanding of what the impact on neighborhood diversity is.
Mr. Contreras, I think you were next.
I thought I understood Mr. Kreger's request, but if we're using, why wouldn't we try to figure out, using the invitation information we have this year on the interim basis, how that would juxtapose on an 8-tier system?
Oh, sure, let's do that.
I mean, that would be the easier way, because it would show it seems to me that it would reflect some of the data that we've already seen as far as the distribution by zip code. And I don't know, and I'm not being critical here, I just want to know, what are we going to find out in terms of neighborhood diversity that we don't already have some inkling as to what it would look like?
Well, Mr. Contapasis, I think when we tier census tracts based on the factors that we've established, right, we don't know how that will impact residents in 02124 or Roxbury or West Roxbury, right? And if, to Ms. Sullivan's point, we are hoping to see not just socioeconomic, but neighborhood diversity represented in these exam schools. So students across the city are coming to learn from and with each other, right? It'd be nice to know what model, how many tiers it would take to see a decent reflection of students from each of these neighborhoods. And the only way that I think you can get there as a model is by seeing how it plays out on past invitation rates. I'm not going to belabor this, especially if there are other better ideas, and I see lots of hands up to help us understand how neighborhood diversity is represented.
Thank you.
Dr. Chung.
I think that we know who gets invited by zip code or by census tract or by tier. When you have disparity within any of those geographic designations, we know who ends up getting invited. So the only way around that without knowing family income or home ownership or anything like that is a lottery. That's the only fair way for kids to be invited once they're in the applicant pool.
Ms. Lum?
I'm sort of, I think, following on these last two comments. From my perspective, we have two different systems, right? We have the old system, which is the IC and GPA for math and ELA. And we have this proposed system where, if I'm understanding the direction of the conversation, we're thinking that maybe there will be potentially seats allotted by tier or assigned to tier as opposed to ranking students. That was one of the suggestions in the slide, correct?
I think
you'd have the 20% citywide, but then the remaining seats would be equally allotted to the tiers. That was one of the.
Right, and you would still need a way to differentiate who within each tier gets a seat.
Right.
So if we're thinking about past practice, we would probably rank students within that tier still. But to Dr. Tung's point, and I think one you've raised before, you could also do a lottery within the tier.
Right.
So
I was going to bring up the fact that lottery within the tier, but I was also just thinking in terms of comparison, since we're talking about somewhat apples and oranges, just knowing based on those who were invited in the school year 2021, where they slot against those tiers and where the tiers were empty or where the tiers weren't filled at all, will give you the distribution of what didn't happen. It would give you the gap or the historical gap that happened that year, correct?
I'm not sure what you mean.
So if
that would
someone-
be, yeah, how proportional invitations were across the tiers.
Exactly.
Yep.
So you may have a tract that actually had 0 invitations that got an zero invitations last in that 2021 year. But then if you also include the data from this year's interim model, you might see where that gap was filled as well. Right?
Yes. Ms. Garrett?
Thank you. I don't know if maybe this is the time to kind of see where we are on this topic, or if this is for another conversation, but I do think it's really important to assess where we are related to the idea of a lottery. I think we should consider our charge of what we were tasked to do and what that means. And I think listening to families from multiple neighborhoods, backgrounds, and positions on this issue, I think that the inclusion of a lottery system with no differentiation between students in any one group serves to make more families in Boston of all identities, backgrounds, and socioeconomic backgrounds more frustrated with the process than not. And while it could certainly result in a student body that achieves the goal of the working group, I think that we should explore all possibilities and models that allow us to achieve the same goal in a way where families, students, educators, et cetera, feel like they have some greater degree of exercise in this process than relying on a number that is drawn. I just don't, I'm very, very uncomfortable with the idea of the lottery, and I just felt like I wanted to say that. And I don't know when we're going to be discussing that or assessment specifically, but if we can make time for it, I think that would be important, because I don't agree, and I know there are a lot of things we don't agree on, but that's a big bucket to consider. So I think we should make the time or make the space to do so.
Dr. Tong?
Can I try to explain why I propose lottery? So once we decide, who the applicant pool is and whether we're dividing by zip code or tier, it would give every student performing at grade level in that catchment area a shot at attending one of the schools. It avoids, as I said just now, the economic disparity within zip codes, census tracts, and even within feeder schools. It takes the stigma out of not getting an invite. Students feeling less than or feeling ashamed or embarrassed. It takes the burden off teachers, some of whom feel pressured by some families and by the stakes to inflate grades, to test prep, to rank students. And a lottery might also have the effect of changing the enrollment of the feeder schools and the other high schools in Boston. So those are some of the reasons why I landed on lottery. And that's just part of my proposal, but it's the part that's relevant to this conversation.
Ms. Grassa?
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to comment on the lottery as well. I was also thinking it would take away the stigma pieces, which are real and felt very heavily. I think from public comment, we've heard it, but I can also say as a school leader. But I also think the lottery aligns with our school choice system as a district to enter schools in Boston initially. And while I know this is not our charge, there are a lot of inequities about how to get into high schools within the city of Boston. And if the exam schools can do it, why can't everybody else? And in making sort of a shift and thinking about more globally, how are we equitable as a school district? And so I just wanted to say that about the lottery.
Thank you, Ms. Grassa. Mr. Acevedo.
Say paradigms can shift, minds can be changed. And I'm speaking of my own. To be honest, Rachel, when I heard lottery, at first, my instinctive, visceral reaction was, you voiced it so well. But Dr. Tun, you've got me thinking. Now, I'm not quite yet converted to the idea of lottery. But I do want to hear more about it. And I think the more that we talk about it, there are some third rail things that we need to talk about. And I think the more we talk about it and air it out, we may demystify some of these things. And what do we mean by assessment? What do we mean by lottery and why? Frankly, I think of, there are families that are bummed if their child does not get into their favorite charter school, but they don't question the fairness of my child getting into that charter school or not. It's just bum luck that my child did not get in and others did. And their answer to that is we need more of them. And maybe that would be a great response. We do need more, right? Wonderful centers of education, schools in BPS. And maybe that will help compel us there. But I'm listening. And my paradigm is prepared to be shifted. And my mind is prepared to be changed.
Ms. Lum.
I just want to make a distinction that there's eligibility and there's invitation. Eligibility is about the student's achievement and student's worth, and that's where your pride should come in as both a parent as a student. And what we come up with eligibility could include assessment. Assessment does not have to be separate from lottery. Lottery can be the means for invitation, but not the means for eligibility. And that's a difference.
Mr. Contempasis.
Yeah, I echo what Mitch Skerritt suggested. I don't like the lottery. I don't know how it removes any kind of stigma. If you're a straight A student and you've worked hard, what we're suggesting is that student is going to be set aside because the process was a lottery and we didn't take into consideration the student's academic achievement. The task of this committee was to address the charge that was before us. I think we've done that in terms of the outcomes, at least, of the applications and the data we've looked at. The one concern that came up during this entire process is how do we deal with the students who may not be in a situation in the zip code where they would have any shot because of the fact that they don't address the median income of the family. We were charged with expanding the applicant pool. We did that. We were charged with maintaining, as although we've had definitions and disagreements, the rigor of the 3 schools. We were charged with improving the racial, socioeconomic, and geographic diversity of all students, K to 12 in the city. I think we've done that. We were charged with looking at other districts to see if there was something that we could incorporate as a permanent effort to ensure that what we accomplish this year is sustained and improved. We were asked to look at the interim plan, and we did that. And we've also looked at the data at all 3 schools, at least from the invitation list. All 3 schools, as a result of what we have done, total population is majority minority. We have increased the diversity at all 3 schools. The question now is, how do we sustain it? And I believe we have taken steps to try to do that. So we can go on and look at data and look at different options. What we have in front of us is, I believe, a decision around an assessment, a decision around ensuring the relevancy and the readiness of the applicant pool, and then finding a way to make certain that if we use grade point average one more time, that we at least have taken into consideration all of the concerns that have been raised about using straight grades. So I happen to like the 8-tier system, modified the way Mr. Krager suggested. I also like Ms. Skerritt's recommendation that we try to establish whether indeed that has addressed the low-income housing concerns, and find a way, if we have to improve on that. But we need to also, I think, consider that we've heard a lot about how we select the students, how we invite them. And so the important pieces here from my perspective is whether we, first of all, agree on a 20-80 distribution, whether we substitute the tiers as we've discussed them, whether we buy into whether the 20% is selected strictly on the basis of their grade point average, how we select the 80%, and I would suggest it worked with the zips. It will work if we use the same process. And that comes down to, what do we use the assessment for if we use one? And what our thinking is around the assessment. We've had concerns around both sides of the equation. No assessment is perfect. And we know the pros and cons, but we still have to determine the readiness of the applicant pool somehow. And we also need, I believe, to utilize, once again, in isolation, the grade point average. Because I don't know how you then determine, unless you go strictly to a lottery across the entire process, and you might as well dismantle the exam schools, in my mind, if that's what you're going to do. So, you know, we have 2 short weeks left if we're trying to meet our June 9th deadline. If we're going to make a decision one way or the other, we can continue to ask for data. But when one looks at the invitation list at the 3 exam schools, the percentages of Black Latinx students at both Latin Academy and the O'Brien is in the majority. The percentage at BLS is greater than it ever was during the years of the Garrity administration. We have done a great deal to include students that might not have even considered the 3 schools. English language learners, students with IEPs. We've put the burden on the district to try to improve not only the applicant pool, but also to try to ensure that there is support for these kids. And so I would argue that the 3 exam schools now are 3 of the most diverse schools in the city, and probably 3 of the most diverse schools in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So that's a long-winded way, and I apologize for my editorializing. But starting to talk about a lottery and fairness and all of that, I think does a discredit to the students who, regardless of the gaming of the grade point average, have worked hard and should be considered in some sort of order for that, particularly if the data shows us what the invitations have shown us this year.
So Dr. Tung, your hand is raised, then Ms. Grassa, then Ms. Garrett.
Well, I think Mr. Contapas covered a lot of ground, and I just wanted to respond.
Please.
Some of them. I agree that this past year's method with GPAs and zip codes increased representation in exam schools in many ways. But I think we could do even better, because diverse is not representative. It's not, they're not equal. And when I suggest a lottery, I was separating eligibility from selection, and we can still maintain rigor with a lottery, because we were able this past year to, let me just find my data here. From this past year's policy, 92% of 7th grade invitees and 97% of 9th grade invitees had a B+ or higher, which in our conversations around rigor, I think while we have different definitions of rigor, we all agreed that students who attend the exam schools should be performing at grade level, and I think a B+ gets us there. And then this was a response I had to last week's meeting, and I want to raise it again because the 20% citywide has come up a couple of times, and I don't agree with 20% citywide as the first, as the top group, because in the slide deck from May 18th, there's a slide that shows that the 20% citywide, there's a couple of slides that show that those students are not representative of the district demographics. And so they actually do not help us to get closer to our charge. So if we're trying to have a pool that's more representative of the city, we should not allocate 20% citywide. And I'll stop there for now.
Ms. Grassa, and then Ms. Garrett, then Ms. Lum.
Thank you. I want to clarify about the lottery as well. I was not thinking of just straight lottery. I was thinking like there would be some sort of eligibility pool, whether that be we do the 20% and then there's the eligibility between like a test and grades or whatever the decisions we make. And then the remaining percent would be the lottery, but not just a straight overall lottery. So I did just want to clarify that. I think it's very hard at this point to make a blanket decision about like, I'm not into the lottery or I'm not into the 20%, I'm not into this or that. Because we have to kind of come to an understanding about which of the pieces we want, because some of these things would fit based on the other portions of the process that we accept. So I don't know that we're looking to come to an idea that everyone agrees on lottery or not today. But I thought my idea was that it could be a portion of the process, not the straight and only process, that there would have to be some sort of eligibility piece first.
Ms. Garrett, Ms. Lum, then Mr. Krieger.
Thank you. And I'm sorry if my comments implied that I didn't understand the nature of the suggestion. I absolutely understand that it's a suggestion for an eligibility pool and then a lottery within that pool. My concerns are the same, but I do want to acknowledge that that was the suggestion. I'm wondering why we are creating tiers and considering, how we can lift up socioeconomic disadvantaged students and doing modeling. If we're talking about eligibility and then a lottery, my question becomes, why are we doing this? If it's simply about receiving a result of grade level students with, no prioritization within those eligible students, why are we separating them out by neighborhood? Lottery by nature would do that anyway. And so I'm confused why we're here at the same time that we're also trying to create this these tiers that are trying to achieve the same goal. I do think that it is not accurate that a lottery system for the exam schools would have a beneficial effect on enrollment anywhere else in the district. I think actually the K-8 complications and the system that we have actually sometimes drive families away to other districts as it is. I don't think it's a model that we should say because we do it elsewhere, we replicate it. For those of us who've been through the lottery as parents, it ain't fun. And it does often send folks out of the city. And so the idea that, folks would stay in the city and know that their child could get straight A+, the highest score on a MAP exam, perfect attendance, all of these indicators, regardless of what their background is, and could not get offered a seat at any of the 3 exam schools, is a major shift, a much more major shift than anything that has been considered. And I think I just want to say that as a head of school, the student body that it would enroll would be great. My concern isn't coming as an administrator of the school in terms of would I be able to serve an academically ready group that came from a lottery? Absolutely, be wonderful. I'm wearing the hat of a Boston resident and a parent who thinks that it would be seen as extremely arbitrary and antithetical to the nature of exam schools to do this policy. And I think the challenge is that we all have different philosophies around the nature of exam schools, but I don't think that's our charge. So I just wanted to clarify that piece. I do think it's a healthy conversation, but I think we're having it as people removed from the process of their children being involved. So I think it would be important to think about how families of younger students would view this policy, because objectively, I'd happily enroll students who were admitted this way and it would solve a lot of challenges, but I might personally be moving outside the city myself as Zach's mom.
Ms. Lum, and then Dr. Tell. And then I'm sorry, I lost track of time. We will need to start. This is such a wonderful conversation. But we do need to go to public comment. But Ms. Lum.
Tabling the selection method an invitation method aside, I do want to address GPA and talk about GPA from my perspective. I think one of the reasons why the system gets gamed is because we are always emphasizing ELA and math. When you look at grade 5 core standards, there's more than ELA and math to be covered by the state. There's science, there's arts, there's social studies and history. And I am wondering if there's an opportunity to randomize from year to year the two areas that BPS would use to select students for eligibility. So instead of having to score B or better on math and ELA every year, maybe it's math and science. Maybe it's ELA and history or social studies, rather than just consistently math and ELA from year to year. I think that also will hopefully, much like trickle-down economics, this might be trickle-down education, where if the higher, most rigorous schools in the district are requiring demonstrated achievement in different categories aside from math and ELA, the investments in those other categories might improve in the pipeline. Just a thought, maybe naive.
Thank you, Ms. Lum. Dr. Tong.
I just wanted to give my answer to Ms. Garrett for why not, if we're talking about a lottery, why not to go with a citywide lottery? And my proposal would be, and I guess the reason is because we know that applications differ across the district. And so to increase representation from feeder schools, from neighborhoods, doing a lottery of eligible students. My proposal is feeder school. So by feeder school would increase representation across the city than a straight lottery.
Thank you. So that was a very rich conversation, and to Mr. Contenpas's point, we do need to start landing our plane here. My words, not his. And so, what I really want to encourage us to do over this long rainy weekend is to give this, the conversations of the past couple of the past 2 weeks, just some deep thought, and really try to, put, if you have, ideas at this point about what this policy could look like or should look like, whether it's building off of what Mr. Contenpas's has presented or it's building off of something else, I'm going to ask truly that we start to put it on paper. Like, let's do that for Tuesday, so that we can really get down to making some decisions here. Also on Tuesday, we should be, and Mr. Contenpas's, let me know if you disagree, we should be prepared to have the conversation about assessment on Tuesday. And let's just spend the majority of our time there, so that we can make some decisions. Because
I think you're right on target. I would say assessment and eligibility, because they go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So with that, unless there's an objection or another burning comment, I'd really like to turn it over to Ms. Parvex this Friday evening at 6:45 on Memorial Day weekend for public comment.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sullivan. We have 2 speakers this evening, and each speaker will have 2 minutes per person. We'll remind you when you have 20 seconds left. Please state your name, affiliation, and what neighborhood you are from before you begin. When I call your name, please raise your hand virtually in Zoom. Make sure you're signing to Zoom with the same name you used to sign up for public comment. That will allow us to identify you when it's your turn to testify. I will move you up as a panelist and we will ask you to turn on your camera for public comment. Our first speaker is Irene Tian. Irene Tian, I will move you in as promote you to panelist. Please turn on your camera and your microphone. Irene.
Hello?
Hello. There's some feedback. Hello.
Hello?
Let's start.
Okay. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My name is Irene Tian and I live in West Roxbury. I am in 5th grade and my brother is currently attending BLS. We live in the same block as Kilmer School, which unfortunately my brother and I were not able to attend as we were not able to win the entrance lottery. Kilmer was an excellent school in the past. In the past, most of their students went to the exam schools. They had 41 kids go to the exam schools last year. But this year, my friend's sister's class had no students going to the exam schools at all, not even the top student in the class, because of a line separating a piece of paper plus stricter teacher gradings. The other class had 7 kids go to the exam school, much less than last year. The task force does have a very hard time and important job that will decide the future of thousands of potential students in the Boston area. Please be very careful. We want to help kids in less fortunate economical conditions, but please don't shut down the door for other kids just because they are in the wrong zip code. Arbitrarily based systems like this benefit or hurt people without knowing their background. That being said, this will not stop me from trying, even with my disadvantages. I will try my best, even though my future is not guaranteed, because I know my merit will seem sooner or later by my city. I hope one day no one will fight over race, skin color, or zip code anymore. We all need to be united and encourage us students of Boston to reach higher and higher peaks and achieve our potential. My city can do it.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Travis Marshall. Mr. Marshall, please unmute yourself and turn on your camera.
Hi, good evening. My name is Travis Marshall, and I'm a parent of 2 BPS elementary students in Rosendale. And I want to thank this task force for its work this many months and for the thoughtful discussion around matters of fairness and equity. While it may prove impossible to design an admissions process that both fulfills the task force's charge and also meets the approval of all stakeholders, I want to reiterate the importance of moving past an admissions exam assessment. In a city council hearing last fall, Ms. Monica Roberts and Ms. Scarrett both acknowledged that they know of no standardized test on which students of color score higher than white students on average. As Dr. Ibram Kendi wrote in his statement to the school committee on this very topic, quote, either there's something wrong with the test takers or there's something wrong with the tests. No test is without bias and no test is immune to the advantages of wealth. While returning to a test may indeed be the politically expedient decision, we cannot continue gatekeeping our public schools using instruments with origins in the eugenics movement. There may be many hardworking students who did not receive a seat at their preferred school this year. I empathize with children whose dreams are not always borne out, but no more than I do with children whose dreams meet structural barriers at every turn. I know there's much work to do in BPS to expand access and opportunities for all students, but that work and the work of breaking down historic barriers for students of color are not mutually exclusive. This year, many US colleges and universities admitted their most diverse incoming classes ever, largely due to dropping SAT and ACT application requirements. The students least likely to submit test scores were first generation, low income, Native, Black, and Latinx. The use of standardized admissions tests rooted in exclusion and racism offer only the veneer of merit. Their time has passed, and we should not allow the magnetism of that illusion to dictate the opportunities of Boston students. Thank you so much, and I wish you all a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sullivan, Mr. Contempasis, that concludes our speakers for public comment.
Thank you.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Contempasis?
If there's nothing further, I will entertain a motion to adjourn this very, as Mr. Acevedo said before he left, fruitful meeting.
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Is there a second? Thank you.
Second.
Is there any discussion or objection to the motion? Ms. Pavek, will you please call the roll?
Thank you. Ms. Aguirre,
Yes.
Mr. Kreger,
Yes.
Ms. Grassa,
Yes.
Ms. Lam,
Yes.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Yes.
Ms. Garrett,
Yes.
Dr. Tang,
Yes.
Ms. Sullivan,
Yes.
and Mr. Contempasis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, the meeting is adjourned. You all have a very safe, healthy weekend and do the home lesson that Miss Sullivan gave you.